Welcome to This Old App, a podcast about learning, coding, smashing stuff together, breaking things apart, startups, failing, winning, and any other buzzwords we can think of.
I would like to welcome Mark Thompson back to our shows. Mark, you were a visitor and you were a guest on our CTO Think podcast a few weeks ago. But go ahead and reintroduce yourself and tell us what you're up to.
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks for having me on. It is always a pleasure to talk with you, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so my name is Mark Thompson. I am a software engineer, and I work in education right now. And I'm also the founder of a small little company called Totally Strong Inc., where our primary product is a fitness app called Totally Strong. And if folks are interested in knowing more about that, they can go to totallystrong.me, where they can sign up for our beta.
Awesome. So we've talked before about this, and I follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle again?
Yeah, that's Mark Texon. So that's MARK, T as in Tom, ECHSON.
Okay. So if people follow you on Twitter, then they know that you've been working on this project for a while, and you are using a technology that I'm not very familiar with called Flutter. So today I wanted to talk to you about Flutter, why you chose it, what is it, why you chose it, your experience. So let's go with what is Flutter?
Flutter itself is a library that's created by a team at Google for cross-platform mobile applications.
So it's like React Native in that sense.
Right, in that sense. But here's where Flutter differentiates itself in a unique way. Flutter primarily does not use JavaScript at all. It actually uses Dart, which is another internal language used at Google, but it's gaining a little bit of speed now and interest because people are starting to jump on the Flutter bandwagon, so to speak. So it's getting more popular.
So talk about Dart then before we go back into Flutter. Like, what is Dart? Why is Dart around? I mean, JavaScript is kind of the hot language, and both you and I have taught JavaScript to a lot of our students. What is Dart, and why are people moving in that direction?
Yeah, so many, many moons ago, Google created Dart as a way to write JavaScript in a more structured way. So this is back in the Wild West of JavaScript. Dart came out, and you used to be able to transpile Dart down to JavaScript to run in the browser. Mm-hmm. And recently what happened was, I guess the team at Google decided that when they were working on this new library for cross-platform mobile apps that have really high performance that don't use JavaScript, they chose Dart to do that. And there's some really interesting articles out there about the reasons why Dart works so well with Flutter. I'm not as deep into that side of it yet, but there are some resources out there to find out more.
So even before we talk about Flutter, how did you learn Dart? And based on your learning curve of other tech, what was the difficulty? How did you learn it? What was the difficulty? Just how did you get into Dart in the first place?
Yeah, so with Dart, it really came around from the fact that when I saw Flutter in a Google I/O talk, I noticed that was the language being used, and I started to dive deeper into Dart. And in terms of learning curve, it's a little bit interesting for me. So primarily over the last 5 years, I've done 5 or 6 years actually, I've done mostly JavaScript, front-end web development, and then in full stack, still using JavaScript on the Node side. But before that, I was actually a Java engineer for many, many years of my career. And so I had a lot of experience with the idea of the statically typed language, where you can define your types and use them in your code. And you can get all kinds of help from the compiler, etc. So Dart is almost what I call a cross between Java and JavaScript, in the fact that it does support some dynamic typing where you don't have to know the type at the time you declare a variable, but it also supports static typing, which gives you a lot of power to have runtime checking and compile time checking, etc.
So then, did you spend a lot of time learning Dart first before you dove into Flutter?
No, I read a couple of articles on the Dart Lang website, And I think and that part of that comes from the fact that I have had so many years experience coding
Sure.
that I just said, okay, you know what? Let me just read some of the ideas about what we need to do and how it should work. And then I'll jump back into Flutter because I really wanted to stick to this deadline that I had set for myself with this project.
Okay. For an experienced developer, you may not need to learn all the ins and outs of Dart just to get started with Flutter. It may help, but it's not completely necessary. I mean, frankly, I did the same with Rails. I learned Rails framework before I learned much Ruby at all. So going now into Flutter, I remember reading your tweets, but this is back in December, and your tweets were always like a lot of them were about motivation of getting your project done, but some of it had to do with Flutter, and you were using a beta product. So between December, now it's around April, 4 months later. What has been your experience with this beta level platform, and is it even stable yet? I don't even know.
Yeah, great question. So when I started, it hadn't even hit beta yet. It was still alpha. And my experience was a mixed bag, really. So I usually would tell anyone who came up to me and said, "Hey, Mark, I want to build an app really quickly. What should I use?" The first question I'm going to ask is, what do you know? What language do you know? And then I say, let's find a tool that matches your skill set so you can be as productive as possible. And I would have done that with Flutter, or with some other product, but I didn't want to. I really want to push myself to say, is there anything out there that I have not used that I could learn from that has a really high upside if it works? And that was my big motivation behind Flutter, because not only does it not use JavaScript, it also gives it a performance boost when you want to do things like high quality animations. And we all know that if you use the React Native or a native script or some other language that has a JavaScript bridge, the common animation side is really tough. And with the competitive landscape of apps, I think static apps that just go from one page to the other, I think those don't have as much of a benefit when it comes to wowing users, especially when I'm thinking about my demographic. People want to feel good with the tool they're using. So I said, okay, what can I use that once I learn how to do the animations, they'll be easy to do and they'll work out of the box cross-platform.
Yep. So you're working on an alpha program, and maybe this could be different, but my experience with alpha is not much documentation, not much examples online or tutorials online that you can use, and not a whole lot of Stack Overflow or other debugging site type of resources. So what did you have available when you started using Flutter versus what's available now?
The Flutter website itself was pretty well documented for a lot of the core components I found. And I mean things like how to make a page itself. But then when you want to dive deeper, I found that website, the real documentation from the Flutter team, I found that it was missing some parts, to be honest with you. And that was challenging. There was really no Stack Overflow that was valid because it was so alpha that things changed since the time some of those questions were answered. Sure. And one of the things that I had was there are 2 code labs on Google, which I didn't even know about this resource, to be honest with you. There's this site by Google called Code Labs, and they walk you through a lot of their technologies in these 60 to 70 minute interactive tutorials. So I used that a bunch of times. I rewatched some of the Google I/O presentations and I would pause the screen to see what was on their slides, so I can see at that time what was working. Because I'm like, okay, I don't really know what to do. And that was available to me. And the final thing that I used the most was the chat app Gitter, Gitter. So a lot of the devs hang out on there. And I would go on Gitter and I'd ask questions sometimes because there are like 100 of us asking at the same time. A question might go unanswered. Sometimes I post questions on Stack Overflow, but again, it might go unanswered because people aren't really looking there or they don't have the skills to kind of answer those questions yet. So, I had those kind of options.
So what you're telling me, and this is especially for any listeners that are new to code and learning, you are a teacher. You teach people which in some ways makes you an expert in a lot of people's eyes on the code we're teaching, which may not be true, especially for me. Sometimes I'm teaching things I don't use all the time, tools, that is. But you are describing what you are doing as an experienced developer to learn. And you're watching videos and you're pausing in the middle and you're going back and rewatching things and you're talking straight to the dev community about that particular tech. And I do the same, but I sometimes I feel like our students often get like they freeze and they don't reach out and do those things. And I'm not sure why we do it versus what they do as experience, I think. But you are doing that. Like you are basically admitting, I don't know how to do this, and I'm going to hammer this into my brain or talk to the people directly to get it done. So I think that's just it's a good lesson for anyone that's trying to learn a new technology, that especially in an alpha situation, you may have to go the old fashioned route and just talk to people one way or the other to find out things. So go ahead.
No, say, and I think with talking to the people, I went on Twitter and I was messaging people, like mentioning them in my tweets that were part of the Flutter team. And I would just ask them questions literally directly on Twitter, and then I get the feedback of, well, talk to this person via the Google message boards, or then go back to, like I said, the Gitter community, or go on Stack Overflow. And I would read a lot of code. Like that was another thing that I did, because sometimes I just couldn't understand the example, or the example will be missing. So I would go to the code and I view the raw source and see if I can understand, okay, what are these parameters supposed to be? How can I, and then I use some of the tools from the code where you can click on a class and then you can see, well, this class extends this class and there's inheritance. So I can start to trace the inheritance chain and start to see what I could find out that way.
So digging into the code is a pretty, for I would say a lot of beginners, that would be that would be going farther than they've ever gone before. How often did you do that with JavaScript?
Almost never.
Exactly.
Which is funny. I never had to do that.
And neither have I. And I don't know if I ever will. But yeah, I mean, when you don't have a lot of resources, sometimes it means like opening the hood, looking at the engine directly, kind of thing. So you've launched. You basically do you have it on multiple platforms, or are you using just one?
No, I launched on iOS and Android.
Okay. How was that experience? Even with an alpha product or alpha framework, how is pushing it to those two platforms? How did that go?
One thing they do pretty well with Flutter is they have a checklist that you can walk through and say, here's what you need to do to actually get it off your machine, get it into the different app stores. So that part was good, but getting it into the app store was a nightmare for me, to be honest with you. Like I was defeated one night because I just couldn't figure out what Google wanted. And it wasn't really the Flutter problem. That was just my inexperience of working with the Android Google Play Store. Then when I went to iOS, I couldn't figure out how to create all the different images that it needed for the different resolutions of the screen sizes. Like that was a big, you need like 15 different image sizes. And I didn't realize that. So when I do my build and then trying to set up, the different test groups, all those things. So that part was worst. I hated that part, to be honest with you.
So I guess if you were to go back in time and, tell yourself at that point, hey, you need to be prepared for certain things, how would someone go about answering those questions ahead of time? Like, where would they get the information, I guess?
Oh, that's a good question. So I did a lot of searching, but I think the better experience is what I teach students to do now. I always tell students now is that if you have a new project to be turned in, one of the first things I want you to do is get a Hello World working and submit it up to Heroku. Like get it off your computer immediately, not the night before it's due, not an hour before. Do it in the first couple of days, because once you get the process working, you don't have to learn those hard lessons. That's what I would do again, knowing how the App Store works and how you can upload multiple versions and multiple builds of your app.
Yeah.
You could do that. So I would do that early on. Like literally in the first week, I would probably set up the deployment to the App Store early on.
Okay. And when you deploy, you don't have to have it out there. It's not accepted until you turn the switch on, so to speak. So there's nothing wrong with deployment to the App Store because it doesn't go to review until you tell it to, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, that's great advice. I would tell my students the same thing. Quit messing around with GitHub pages like at the last minute. Push that up to the front and get a hello world going. So that's great advice. So now, I don't know, is it Flutter in beta now, or what's the stage it's in now?
So Flutter's in the second beta right now, and they did a lot of updates around using the second version of Dart, which allows you to do some really cool things. So when you're in your code and you have to type new or const everywhere, it has some really intelligent features where you can avoid typing that, and it'll know to instantiate or use a constant version of an object, and that's pretty fantastic because you can cut down on the code, the verboseness of the code a bit.
Yeah. Are there any tools that you're using with Flutter? Like, what are you using for your editor to use Dart and Flutter?
Yeah, I started off with Android Studio, actually. That was my first tool, but I was not familiar with that platform, and that's a really huge tool. Just like when you have Eclipse, right? Eclipse was a huge Java, behemoth, and after a while, it just became too hard to use if you didn't start in the beginning. So I started there, and then I love Visual Studio Code for front-end development, and I'm really familiar with that. So I use Visual Studio Code as my editor. There's a Dart plugin that is community-based, actually, that is really excellent. And so between those two things, I do that. I get an iPhone and an Android phone that I use for my development. I always sometimes use the emulators, but a lot of times I want to test it on the phone itself. So that's another piece of advice. Get the work done to get the app on the phone as soon as you can, because that's also, it's very easy on Android. You just plug it in via USB, but on iOS, you actually have to have a paid developer account just to test on the phone. So getting that set up, again, that's one of the things I would say, get that done early.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. So I guess where are things going with Flutter? Like what? Well, okay, let me actually rewind that. The next question is, you made the choice of Flutter because you wanted to have better animations. That was one point you made or stressed on. How did that work with Flutter? Did you get the experience you were looking for there?
So I've not built in the animations yet, and I keep that in the back of my mind, thinking of something that I'm going to do in maybe a second release. But the other thing I liked about Flutter was how declarative the UIs were, and you could really read it once you look at the code. You can actually read and predict with some certainty what's going to happen because everything's a widget. So you can say new widget, or sorry, new center, and that well, whatever is a child of that widget is going to be centered. Or new column, new row, and you put that type of language, that type of domain language into your code, it really helps it to be easy to create.
Makes sense. Any tools you use for testing that might be unique or that work with Flutter on that part?
Yeah, for testing, there's actually a unit test framework that's already kind of built in that ships with the scaffolding part of the app. So when you scaffold a new app, it sets up your test first. So you can also do that. And that's what I use right now.
Oh, cool. So what do you do anything for acceptance testing, like integration testing?
Yeah, for acceptance testing right now, I ship out so when I ship it, I have someone who's actually going through and testing. We don't have anything automated. I have someone who volunteered to just be, like a user, a UAT tester for me before I send it out to my entire alpha testing group. I have one person who gets to build first, and then he goes through and does some testing.
Awesome. Okay. I think that covers most of it. What are you looking forward to that Flutter says is on the way?
I'm actually looking forward to just more completeness, to be honest with you. There are some parts of the app or the framework that I think still need some polish. And when I started my process, I gave myself like this 30-day window to do the entire thing. And the reason I did that was because I just wanted to see if I could ship. And I know for a lot of developers, if you talk to 9 or 10 developers, we'll all say, I had the idea for XYZ app, but I never got around to finishing it. So I said, okay, rain or shine, success or failure, in 30 days, I'm going to ship this app. And so I did not have a lot of time to wait for new features to come. I needed a lot of things like right now. And that process was really interesting because it really pushed me to practice a lot of what I preach to students. Things like my philosophy about design or software development is make it work, make it right, make it fast. And
Yeah.
so a lot of things just make it work, then make it right. So go back and refactor, make things better, then make it fast. Do optimizations after I've already identified that there was a problem that needs to be optimized. So a
Yep.
lot of that got put into the forefront when I was doing this really 30-day sprint.
Cool. Last question before we call it a day. What's the community like? You talked about you've been on Google Groups, you talked on Twitter. How many people are you able to work with? Not connected, not directly, but how big is that community compared to other platforms you've worked on?
You know what? I think the community is much smaller than other platforms because I think you can find tons and tons of JavaScript help. But what I did notice is that one, the community is growing. The second thing is the community is really responsive. There are quite a few people who followed me on Twitter after they found out I was trying to do this 30-day sprint with my products, and people who are really influential in the community, and they'd offer not only more support, but like code support. People say, how's this going? Oh, look at this repository. This may help you. And a lot of people, one guy, Seth Ladd, who is I think he's one of the program managers for Flutter at Google. He would, from time to time, just mention me on Twitter and say, hey, how's it going? We're rooting for you. And I think that's amazing that,
Nice.
People would do stuff like that because it kept me going when I wanted to quit, which is pretty common when anyone's developing something that's challenging.
Oh, no doubt. So yeah, that you're not going to get that from a lot of communities. There's just so many people, but that's pretty awesome. So actually, I've got another question. Forget my last question thing. If I decided tomorrow that I wanted to get into Flutter and build something, what would you recommend as the first step?
I do the Google Code Lab where they show you how to make the chat app, because that one covers so many different parts of the platform and it gets you familiar with how to make just what we call a material app on the Google side, or you can go with a custom UI if you want to, right? So you have those options. And so I say go with that, with the Code Lab, walk through it, do all the steps, type it yourself. And then I think that'll set you up where, again, the documentation is great and it's constantly improving. So you can go back later on and find out more information. And you just start to ask the question like, how do I make a button that looks like this? And then you start to look through the repository of content and all the plugins that are growing. And so you'll find what you need over time.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, educating us about Flutter and all the support around it and the new community. Congrats on launching the app again. We will put all the links. Totallystrong.me is where people can look for your app. And we will put links to all the other things you referred to in the show notes as well. But we'll call it a day. And thanks for being on, Mark.
I really appreciate your time, and as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks for listening to This Old App. Show notes and previous episodes can be found on our website at www.thisoldapp.online. Reviews on Apple iTunes are always appreciated and help promote the show. For questions, comments, or things you would like to hear on future shows, please email us at hello@thisoldapp.online. Show music is Guns Blazing by Fab Claxton, licensed by Pond 5. Voiceover work by MeganVoices.com. You'll hear from us soon.